Our next speaker is Colonel Arthur J. Athens, United States Marine Corps retired. Colonel Athens is the director of the United States Naval Academy Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. Colonel Athens has served as the Naval Academy's first distinguished military professor of leadership, Commandant of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, the executive director of the OCF, a worldwide nonprofit organization helping in military personnel integrate their faith and profession. A White House Fellow under President Ronald Reagan, a Special Assistant to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration following the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, and a U.S. Marine Corps officer who retired in July 2008 with over 30 years of combined active duty and reserve service and significant command, staff, and instructional positions. In addition to his professional responsibilities, Colonel Athens has been a volunteer lacrosse coach at the high school and collegiate levels. In 2005, the Washington Post recognized him as their High School Lacrosse Coach of the Year. Colonel Athens holds a bachelor's degree in Operation Research from the Naval Academy, where he lettered in lacrosse and received the Alumni Award for overall academic, athletic, and leadership achievement. He also earned a master's degree from the Naval Postgraduate School and the Army School of Advanced Military Studies. He is married to the former Mistina Root of Williamsburg, Virginia, and they have 10 children. It is my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce Colonel Athens.
Well, good morning. It is true, I do have 10 children. And I should have my wife with me, who's the mother of all those 10 children. And they're all with the same wife, and yes, we know how it happens, so just in case you're wondering. It's an honor and a privilege to have this opportunity to be the final speaker at this outstanding conference. I'm encouraged by looking out into the crowd and looking at young men and women who are committed to developing their leadership ability and who are committed to making a difference. As I was driving in this morning, I live about an hour south of Annapolis, and I was thinking about John Gardner. John Gardner was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare when that was the name of the department under President Lyndon Johnson. John Gardner is the one who actually started the White House Fellowship Program to allow young leaders to get exposure to high-level leadership and encourage them to be servants of the nation. And John Gardner used to say that in a sparsely populated set of colonies, we had leaders like Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Madison and Monroe and Hamilton and Franklin, and the list went on. And John Gardner used to say, with our current population, we should have 10 to 20 times the number of outstanding and extraordinary leaders like them. But he wasn't sure that it was happening, and that was one of the reasons he instituted, through President Johnson, the White House Fellowship Program. But I look out here, this is the potential. You have the potential to be the future Washington, Adams, Madison, Monroe, and the list goes on. But the question really is, what are you going to do with what you've heard while you've been here? Not just for this conference, but other conferences you go to, other books you read. What are you going to do with what you hear or read? If you have a list of 20 different things that you've taken notes on over the last couple of days and you want to change 20 things in your life, I will tell you it won't work. I think you need to walk away from this conference with one or maybe two things you really want to change about yourself that will allow you to be the kind of extraordinary leader you could become. You've heard a lot over the last 3 days. You've heard that organizational crises are fairly routine. You will experience them. Organizational crises are complex. Organizational crises have moral and ethical implications. Organizational crises may be the defining moment as a leader or for your organization. And as many of the speakers have said, you need to be as prepared as possible for those crises to come. All good words. But what are you going to do with what you've heard? And this morning, I'd like to actually take one other perspective on leadership and crises, one that I don't think we've touched on yet. And to do that, I've put together a montage, if you would put that slide up, Kyle, of a couple of folks. You probably recognize the man in the middle. His name, Abraham Lincoln. If you go to the top left, who's that? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you go clockwise, top right, who is that? Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York. If you continue around the loop, who's that? Tony Dungy, former coach of the Indianapolis Colts. If you continue around, the next gentleman, Joe Torre, former manager of the New York Yankees. Continuing around, General David Petraeus, commander of Central Command, responsible for the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And then finally, the last gentleman might not be as recognizable. Does anybody know who he is? Woody Johnson. He's the owner of the New York Jets. My question is, what's common about all those people? And it's this. Well, it's not their backgrounds or upbringings. It's not their race or ethnicity. It's not their professional calling. The thing that is common about those people on the screen are that they all had to lead others while facing their own personal storm, their own personal crisis. Had nothing to do with an organizational crisis. They were facing a crisis internal to their own life, and yet had to continue to lead. Abraham Lincoln lost a son while President of the United States from typhoid fever. Franklin Delano Roosevelt struggled with polio as he led the nation. Rudy Giuliani had cancer as he ran New York. Tony Dungy had a son who committed suicide while he was coaching, working towards the Super Bowl. Joe Torre had cancer while he was managing the Yankees in their run to the pennant. David Petraeus has cancer, but yet has to lead the Central Command. Woody Johnson just lost his daughter just 2 weeks ago as the Jets were competing in the playoffs. Leading while facing a personal storm or a personal crisis. Kyle, if you'd put the next one up. I've been leading for over 35 years, and what strikes me is how common this is amongst leaders. Having something happening to yourself while you're having to still lead others, whether or not you have an organizational crisis going on. You might have both things, both an external crisis and then something that's happening to you. It could be a death in the family. It could be a personal injury or illness or ailment. It might be a broken personal relationship with someone that's breaking your heart. It could be dealing with an ailing parent. The list goes on. Typically, those crises are prolonged. And often as you're going through them as a leader, there's no end in sight to the pain and the difficulty. Where organizational crises often are fleeting. They happen and they're gone and they're done. But this one might stick with you for a while. Some of you in leadership positions where you are may already be going through one of those. I don't know. But I do know this. If you're going to continue to lead, you will find yourself in the midst of a personal storm and still having to lead. There's a funeral director who used to sign all his correspondence and emails, "Eventually yours." That's the truth of leading in the midst of a storm. Not an organizational crisis, but a personal storm. And that's what I'd like to think through with you a little bit today, because if you're not experiencing it right now, you will. And I'd like to plant a couple of seeds to assist you when you are attempting to lead in the midst of the storm. Kyle, if you go to the next one. So let me tell you a personal story. It actually took place in 1996 and 1997 in my life. Let me set the scene. I had three major leadership responsibilities. I was the executive director of OCF, a nonprofit organization, 501c3, that had about 10,000 members spread around the world. The purpose of the organization was to help military personnel figure out ways to integrate their faith and their profession. I'd been the executive director for about a year. We were undergoing major strategic changes in the organization. A new vision, a new mission statement, a new set of pillars that would guide what we did. We had a new communication strategy, and we were developing ways for the board and the staff to work better together. I had an executive staff. I had two large conference centers, one in Pennsylvania and one in Colorado. My second major leadership responsibility was I was a Marine Corps Reserve Squadron Commander. I commanded a squadron of 1,200 Marines while I was doing this other job. That unit was in 4 states: Pennsylvania, Virginia, Colorado, and Texas. We had Marines deployed to Central and South America in the drug war. I had Marines deployed in the Middle East for contingency operations, and I had Marines that were supporting NATO operations. I had been the squadron commander for about 6 months. And I also had a wife and 8 children. Our youngest were a set of twins, and they were 2. So I had those 3 major leadership responsibilities when the storm hit. February of 1996. My wife is told to go to a high-tech, high-resolution sonogram. Now, because we had twins, we had 8 children, but there were 7 pregnancies. I had been a part of each one of those going to the checkups, and they would always show the sonogram. I could never tell anything in those sonograms. It was always so grainy to me. But my wife was always enthusiastic. Oh, did you see the hand or the foot? I didn't want to tell her I couldn't see anything. It just looked like grain. But this was a different kind of sonogram. This was a high-precision sonogram that even I could see. And as the doctor put his wand on my wife's stomach, and the projection on the wall showed what was seen, even I could tell something wasn't right. Because you could see the heart chamber, and you could see flapping. Just didn't look right to me. The doctor turned off the sonogram machine and turned to Misty, my wife, and I and said, I have some bad news for you. He said, as I look at your child, there are a number of symptoms to tell me that this child has Down syndrome. But actually more serious is that he has what we call a hole in the heart. The valves aren't formed properly. The heart's not functioning properly. And at some point, this child's going to need open heart surgery to survive. Kind of rocks your world. The pregnancy was difficult for my wife. I still had to lead. Then our son Daniel, and Kyle, if you'll put that up. Our son Daniel was born on August 5th, 1996. He would spend the first 3 weeks of his life in the pediatric intensive care unit. I didn't even know there was one of those, affectionately called the PICU. 3 weeks. And Misty and I had made a commitment that one of the 2 of us were going to be at his side at all times. I still had to lead. And then Daniel would have 2 heart procedures, 5 different extended stays in the pediatric intensive care unit, open heart surgery, and a final 2 weeks in the pediatric intensive care unit. And Daniel would die on April 30th, 1997, the age of about 9 months. Wow. That was all going on while I was leading OCF, leading a Marine Corps Reserve Squadron, and leading my family. So I'd like to share something with you. Kyle, if you'd put the next one up. What I experienced, what I learned, and how I changed. Because I found there's not a lot written on this. There's some, but not a lot. It's not necessarily talked about a lot when we talk about leadership. There's a lot of books written about leading in the midst of an organizational crisis. But to be truthful, it's going to be more common to have to lead in your own personal storm, because you'll find that as part of life. So I did learn a couple of things. This is what I felt. I felt fatigue. No one told me what to expect as I was doing this, trying to lead while in the midst of a storm. I was so tired, and I had been on contingency operations, I had been overseas, all those kinds of things. I had never been so tired. We would have to feed Daniel about every 2 or 3 hours when he was home, because he could only eat a little bit at a time, but he needed to keep his strength up. 2 to 3 hours a night, night after night after night after, and then having turns when he would be in the pediatric intensive care unit. I was so tired. Second of all, I was angry. No one told me I would be angry, but I was. I kept asking why. Why is this happening? Why Daniel? Why now? Why? And I hate to admit this, but I'm going to admit it. It's the only time in my life that I've punched a wall. But I did. And it was stupid, because now not only was I tired and angry, I had a hurt hand that I didn't want to tell anybody about, because I was embarrassed that I would be that angry to hit a wall. But I was. I felt fear of failure. I just wasn't sure I was going to be able to pull it off. And I felt a numbness that I can't even explain. I would sit down to do something that was routine. I just couldn't do it. Part of it was being tired, but there was something else that was going on. I was just numb. I had never found it in any of my leadership books. No one had told me about this at the Naval Academy. Nobody had told me about this at the basic school in the Marine Corps. Nobody had prepared me for those set of feelings while I was trying to lead. Now, I think those feelings tend to come in general with those kinds of crises that we face personally, but they are intensified when we're still trying to lead. So what did I learn? One of the things I learned is the importance of trust. I had to build trust, unbeknownst to me, very quickly in 2 of those 3 organizations, OCF and my Marine Corps Reserve Squadron. The trust that was built in that short period of time before Daniel allowed me to give things to my subordinates and to also go and tend to some things that I needed to and not be around the office as much as I would normally be, but they trusted me. Some of that trust, I've now learned, actually was built before I ever got to that place because of a professional reputation. You will establish your professional reputation very early on. Make no mistake, it is critical. So when these times come, the trust is partially built just on your reputation, let alone on the leadership that you start to demonstrate to other people. I went to a retirement ceremony down at Quantico last Friday. The person who was retiring worked for me at one time, and there's something he said in his retirement speech that caught me, and I say this humbly, but what he said is, he said our new executive officer was showing up. This actually took place after Daniel's death. He said our new executive officer showed up. His name was Athens. I had already heard all about him, and I knew we were in good hands. How did he know that? He knew it because of what I had done before that moment. And so when you step in, you can fail and destroy that reputation at any moment. But if you keep it going, it builds the trust that's necessary when you have to lead an organization differently than you would on a day-to-day basis. You had to be able to trust people to give them things you would normally do. They had to trust you that even if you weren't there all the time, it was okay. And when the big decisions had to be made, you would roll in and help with those. What I didn't realize is how much it developed my own staff at both OCF and at the Marine Corps Reserve Squadron, because people had to pick up the load. And they learned, and they grew, and they developed. It's taught me how important that is just in the normal day-to-day life, to give people opportunities to grow. And within my own family, our children had to take on a lot more than they ever had before. And I think their success today, the older ones, is very much attributed to that period of time. So I learned how important trust was. I learned how important transparency was, the power of transparency. The worst thing you can do when you're facing a personal crisis as a leader is to keep it all to yourself. Now, there are minor things that happen in our life. I don't recommend coming every 5 minutes to your people and saying, oh, let me tell you the latest hurt I have or the latest problem I have. But if it's something significant like we had, you'd better tell people what's going on. They want to know. They want to know because they're a little afraid. They want to know because they actually care. And the worst thing you can do is shut off all the communications. So I would tell our people what was happening. I also learned the futility of asking why. It's a waste of time. And it's the most common direction we take when we are leading and facing a personal storm. It's a waste of time. You won't know why. I know sometimes people say, oh, you can look back and really understand some of these things. I'm going to tell you, I've been through a lot of things in my life. You still can't piece it all together exactly. Don't try. So I learned the importance of trust. I learned the power of transparency, and I learned the futility of asking why. So how did I change through this? I became a much more humble leader. I think before Daniel, I was much too full of myself. My good friend Will Costantini, who was here yesterday, who's a true American hero, but is a very humble one, said it best. It's not about me. Daniel, that little baby, helped to teach me that it wasn't about me. My wife and I read a book called Angels Unaware, written by Will Rogers and Dale Evans, probably much before your time, but two very prominent people in the probably 40s and 50s, who had a Down child who died at an early age. And this book is written from the perspective of the child. That's how it's narrated in the book. And one of the things that struck me in the book was when that child, speaking, said, you know, sometimes God sends these Down syndrome children like me just to keep the parents with the right perspective of life. That happened to me. I became a much more humble leader. The second thing that happened to me is that I became a much more compassionate leader. I had never been in a pediatric intensive care unit in my life. And I learned how many hurting people there are. And also learned a little bit more about the people who worked for me and the difficulties that they faced that I needed to be aware of. Not long after Daniel died, I got a new sergeant major at my squadron. He was the picture-perfect Marine. He's the guy that you'd want on the Marine Corps commercial, the Marine Corps poster, no emotion, walked with a strut. Everyone was deathly afraid of him, probably even me. He came in one day to my office and he closed the door and he said, "Sir, can I talk to you?" And I said, "Of course, Sergeant Major, sit down." And he just started weeping, not crying, weeping, telling me about he had just found out that his mother, who was the all in all of his life, had just been diagnosed with cancer. He said, "What am I going to do?" I think before Daniel, I would have said some things. I would have counseled him because I was trained as a Marine officer to counsel your people. But because of Daniel, there was something different in how I interacted with that Sergeant Major. It's called compassion, and it's needed in leadership. I don't care whether it's the financial industry or the military or education or the federal government, we need leaders who are compassionate, and Daniel helped teach me that. And I also learned from Daniel to differentiate what's urgent and what's important. Most people spend a lifetime trying to figure that out. I'm still not perfect at it for sure. But every time things approach me, I always kind of put it in the perspective of Daniel. What's really important here and what's just urgent, grabbing at us, saying we've got to do something right now? Be careful of that. I always sit back and watch as I travel on airplanes. And I'm not saying that you've got a deep mental problem, if you're doing this, but I just sit back and watch as the plane lands and the stewardess says, "You may now use your cell phone." Everyone's on. And I'm always thinking to myself, gosh, what's so important? What's driving you? Like, as a military person, I think, gosh, is artillery fire coming in? Like, are they calling in airstrikes? Or what in the world? Okay, I understand setting up someone to come pick you up, but when you watch the faces of the people, I think they've lost perspective. Daniel helped teach me what's important and what gets in the way as being urgent. Ultimately, through this experience of having to lead 3 organizations, if you want to call a family an organization, 3 organizations while facing a storm, I was reminded how important the keel is. This is the Naval Academy, so if there's going to be a demonstration, it has to look sort of nautical, so I will do that. If you look at a sailboat, a lot of times what we see is above the waterline. And as a matter of fact, if we own a sailboat, which I don't, but if I did, I would probably care a lot about how the deck looked, how polished it was, that the sails were well maintained, that the ropes were tied just right. But at my own risk, if I didn't care about what was below the waterline, I would be in trouble. Because the key to the sailboat is not what's above the waterline, it's what's below the waterline, the keel. Because the keel is what provides stability and resilience, particularly in the storm. The worse the storm, the more important the keel becomes. And as leaders, we have our intellect, and as leaders, we have our physiological capability, but don't be mistaken, we also have a soul. It's the keel. It's what's below the waterline. It's not very visible, but I'll tell you, what's really inside comes out in the times of the storm. And if we don't have this keel well maintained, we are at risk to not be able to lead while we're facing that particular storm. And through Daniel, I was reminded how important it was to do a couple of things. Number one, how important it is to actually take time alone to reflect. I think one of the strengths of the first group of people I named, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, Franklin, that set them apart was they did take time alone to reflect on the important issues of life. Why am I here? What's my purpose? Why is there suffering in the world? How in the world can these things happen, both to me personally as well as globally? What happens after I die? I mean, all the important questions. We need to spend time thinking about that, thinking about where we're going. Where did we come from? What's really important in our life? I have a cell phone. I don't have it with me, but I have a cell phone. I have a computer. I have a computer at home. I got a computer at work. I know how to text message. I know how to do Facebook. Those are all great tools. But after a while, they do something to us, and that is they take us away from reflecting. And if you're a leader and you're not reflecting, that keel is at risk. The second thing I learned is read the right things. I'm an operations research major, a math major. I'm a technical guy. I like analysis. I like plans. They're important. But I've learned leadership is mainly about people. So I read Solzhenitsyn. I read Abraham Lincoln, Admiral James Stockdale and his experience as a prisoner of war that was recommended the other day. I read the book of Job in the Bible about suffering. I read the book of Psalms because it talks about, in general, in most of the Psalms, a king who was leading and still had these storms. We have to refresh ourselves with reading the right things. And I also think we need to be connected with humanity. I think sometimes we at elite institutions can actually disconnect from humanity. The pediatric intensive care unit brought me back to humanity. The real world. When I took a high school lacrosse team in crisis, it connected me back to humanity. When I sat on the bus with my guys for the first time, riding to an away game. Like I hadn't ridden on a high school bus with a boys lacrosse team since I played in high school in the mid-1970s. And I began to know those young men, and they were men who had all kinds of hurts and problems, but they also had goals and ambitions. It connected me back because I spent most of my days working with people who were high-class folks, folks that had already sort of made it. It reconnected me to humanity. Have you ever stopped and worked with the elderly or the handicapped or someone of not your race, your ethnicity? Connect to humanity. Because if we take those three things, reflection, reading, and connection to humanity, it helps keep that keel maintained. And you'll need it maintained when you hit that storm. Let me close with a story about someone who had the lead in the midst of a storm. And if you go forward twice. He's not a familiar guy, probably to most of you. His name is Horatio Spafford. Pretty classy name, Horatio Spafford. He was a lawyer, a businessman, and a real estate developer in Chicago in the mid-19th century. He was a very wealthy man. He was considered an incredible leader. He was married and he had 4 children. In 1871, a fire rampaged Chicago, destroyed Chicago. Spafford had set up a voyage for he and his wife and his 4 daughters to go across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to England. The fire occurred and the trip was about to take place, and what he did is he decided to send his wife and daughters ahead of him. because he needed to remain back to lead. So his wife and his 4 daughters travel from Chicago to New York. They get on an ocean liner and go across the Atlantic Ocean. During that voyage, that ocean liner strikes another vessel, and in 12 minutes it sinks. Horatio Spafford receives a telegram from England, from his wife, that says, "Saved alone." Spafford knew that when he received that telegraph and he put it together with the news that he had heard, that he had lost 4 daughters in an instant. So he made the decision he would leave Chicago, go to New York, and get on the next ocean liner to go across the Atlantic, which he did. While he was transiting the Atlantic, he talked to the ship's captain, and he said, "Do you know the location where the ocean liner went down a couple of weeks ago?" And the captain said, "I do. It's in about a day." Spafford said, "Could you please get me when we're close to that spot so I can go up on deck?" He didn't tell the captain why. So the day came, the captain got Spafford and brought him up to the deck, and Spafford took out a piece of paper and a pencil. And he began to write these words as he looked out at the ocean that had enveloped 4 of his daughters not long before that moment. And he wrote these words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, he has taught me to say, it is well with my soul." He would go on to write more. And eventually someone would take those words and put them to music. It's a hymn that is sung often at funerals. It is well with my soul. So when I put all this together, I say this: it really does come down to the keel. Because if our keel is well maintained, then we will survive the storm. And we will exit that storm a more competent, a more courageous, a more compassionate leader. And that's what the world's looking for. That's what the early great leaders of our nation provided: competence, courage, and compassion. And maybe, just maybe, when we are hit with that storm and we still have to lead, that we'll be able to say with Horatio Spafford, "It is well with my soul." You can be the future Washington, Adam, Jefferson, put whatever name you want. But it's not about just having a good feeling when you leave from here. It's about action. It's about changing just one little thing on your movement towards being an extraordinary leader. And normally it takes you telling someone else and having them hold you accountable for that change. And if you do that every time you go to a conference, every time you read a book, every time you are mentored, just one little aspect, one little change, then we're going to be in good hands. And you will be the people who will be able to lead, not just in organizational crises, because to some degree they're a little bit easier. But more importantly, you'll be able to lead when you have your own personal crisis and keep organizations and people moving forward. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here. And I'm actually looking, Bo, is there time for questions? Or I didn't look at my watch. I guess a couple of questions I would be more than happy to answer about what I talked about what you've heard this week, about leadership, Don't ask me why I have 10 children, because it's a really long story, and I don't want to keep you here because you probably have flights and other things, but I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Please be seated. Okay, no one wants to try a hard question on me. Someone is making their way to the microphone.
Sir, I'm in the same class as Julie Devlin from here at the Academy, and what you said really hit home for me, because yesterday I found out that my sister is she's a brain tumor, and I'm going to be there for her for her surgery, and I'm terrified. And what you said, I'm just wondering, everyone here at the leadership conference, whether you're in a combat situation or for me when it hits home with the family, how do you deal with a situation and be strong and when you're just absolutely terrified?
Yeah, I'm not a big hugger. I think one thing is, please sit down, Julie. I think one thing is not trying to pretend that it's not happening in your life, and trying to pretend that things are normal, because they're not. And I think it's very important. One of the things I learned, I could tell you a whole bunch of things I learned. I just gave 3 today. But the other one is that we need one another. I actually wrote an article for OCF called, what's the name of the Beatles song? Well, not all that he needs is love, but I don't know what it was. It was a great article. No, I'm kidding. With a little, with a little help from my friends. I think I was resistant for the help that I probably was going to need. And one of the things I did was more and more welcome that help. And I think that was part of the humbling process for me, that I had to learn that people wanted to help and that I needed their help because I was very, very tired. My wife, I can't describe the partnership and the support and how important she was throughout this whole process. And one of the things that I did learn is that numbness that's there. You got to realize it's going to be there and it's okay. And you know, your GPA, I don't want to tell you this, but your GPA might drop and some other things, but it comes down to what's important and what's urgent. And I also learned that it's important to be at those places that are most important at the right time. I turned down a lot of things during this time to make sure that I was with Misty at the right times. And that's another part of the decision process. But it's okay to cry, it's okay to get help, it's okay to pray, and it's okay to hurt. All those things are part of that process. I had a sister who was killed in an automobile accident when I was 15. And, there was a fairly long grieving process for me. And I remember being deployed when Princess Di was killed in a car accident. And I remember watching the TV cast of this and weeping. And I'm thinking to myself, what? It was years after my sister had died. And I was thinking, I don't really even care that much about Princess Di. What am I doing? There are those times that they just strike. It's part of life. And you accept it, realize it, and then you continue to step forward. And you keep checking your keel, because the keel is going to be that piece that's going to help you as you walk through that. So again, I just point to that as an example. It's so common. It's so common. And if it's not happening to you as a leader, I guarantee it's happening to people that are following you. And to have a sensitivity to that only comes when you're a little bit more compassionate, which I had to go through to get to that point. Any other questions? Okay. Again, the potential's here. The storms will come. Make sure the keel's right. And pick one thing to walk out those doors, tell someone else about it, have them hold you accountable to what you want to change, and go do it. Because we need great leaders. Thanks again. Thanks, both.